The sky above Jerusalem was still the color of a bruise on the morning she walked away from the hill. 3 days had passed since the cross, but the weight of what she had witnessed had not lessened by a single grain. She had stood there at the foot of the wood, not weeping the way the other women wept, not collapsing into the earth the way any mother in history would have had the right to collapse, but standing, simply standing, with a stillness that the disciple John would never fully be able to explain when he tried to write it down years later. She had stood there because love does not run. She had stood there because she had been standing for this moment, in one way or another, since the angel first appeared to her in a room in Nazareth and changed the entire direction of the world. Her name was Mary. She was between 45 and 50 years old. And everything she had ever known was buried in a sealed tomb on the outskirts of the city that had killed her son. What happened to her after that is one of the least examined questions in all of Christian history. The Gospels follow her to the foot of the cross, and the book of Acts places her in the upper room at Pentecost, and between those two moments, and beyond the second one, the written record falls nearly silent. Entire libraries have been built around the words of the men who walked with Jesus, around their journeys and their letters and their deaths. But the woman who had known him longest, who had carried him, before any apostle had ever heard his name, who had said yes to God in a room in Galilee, before a single miracle had occurred, before a single sermon had been preached, before a single soul had been healed, that woman fades from the pages of the New Testament like a figure walking into fog. She does not disappear from history. History simply stops looking for her. This is the story of those years. The quiet ones. The long, ordinary, extraordinary years that followed the cross, and the empty tomb, and the tongues of fire, the years when Mary of Nazareth continued to live her life inside a Roman Empire that had nailed her son to a piece of wood, inside a Jewish community that rejected the message she had believed, before any of them had heard it, inside a body that was aging, carrying the most sacred memory any human being has ever held. She cooked meals. She prayed in the darkness before dawn. She kept things in her heart the way Luke's Gospel says she always kept things in her heart, turning them over slowly, the way a person turns over a stone to see what is living underneath. She was the first believer who ever existed on the face of the earth, and she spent her final years doing what she had always done. Serving. Remembering. Waiting. To understand what her life became after the crucifixion, you have to understand what her life was before it. Not the luminous version of Mary that centuries of painting and devotion have constructed, the serene figure, with downcast eyes and folded hands, always calm, always composed, always drifting slightly above the ordinary weight of being human. The real Mary. The one the Gospels actually describe. She grew up in Nazareth, a village in the region of Galilee in the northern part of what we now call Israel. Archaeological work done over the last several decades has established that Nazareth in the 1st century was a modest agricultural settlement of somewhere between 400 and 500 people, built on limestone rock in the hills of Lower Galilee. It was a village where everyone knew the names of everyone else's grandparents, where the same families had intermarried for generations, where the Jewish liturgical calendar was not a religious observance, but the actual structure of time itself. You did not mark time in Nazareth by the Roman calendar. You marked it by Passover, and Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles, and the Sabbath, that arrived every 7 days like a tide. The famous question that Nathanael asked when he first heard about Jesus, asking whether anything good could possibly come out of Nazareth, was not cruelty. It was honest assessment. Nazareth was not a place where important things happened. Mary grew up knowing the Torah before she could write it. Jewish women in 1st century Galilee were educated in the scriptures, within the home, within the rhythms of a religious life that wove prayer and cooking and weaving into a single continuous act of devotion. The Magnificat, the song she sings in the 1st chapter of Luke, when she visits her older cousin Elizabeth, is the clearest evidence we have of the depth of her formation. She was perhaps 14 or 15 years old when she sang it, and it is not a spontaneous outburst of emotion. It is a carefully constructed piece of theology woven from the Psalms and the Prophets and the Song of Hannah from the 1st book of Samuel. Every line connects to something she had read and meditated on and absorbed into the marrow of her faith. The girl who sang that song was not pious in a shallow way. She was formed the way iron is formed, by sustained heat applied over a long period of time. She was engaged to a carpenter named Joseph when the angel came. The Gospel of Luke does not say she was sitting in a garden or sleeping in a vision. It simply says the angel Gabriel came to her and greeted her and said that she had found favor with God and that she would conceive and bear a son who would be called the Son of the Most High. Her first response was not worship. Her first response was a question. She asked how this was possible since she had not been with a man. It is a reasonable question. It is the question of a person who is present in the moment, thinking clearly, not collapsing into mystical rapture, but actually trying to understand what she is being told. The angel answered her. And then she said the words that define everything that would come after. I am the Lord's servant. May it be done to me according to your word. She did not fully understand. She said yes anyway. That yes, spoken in a small room in an unimportant village by a teenager who had never left Galilee, is the hinge on which the entire story of the next 2,000 years turns. And the woman who spoke it would spend the rest of her life living inside the consequences of having spoken it, consequences that were glorious, and devastating and ordinary, and sacred all at once, often in the same moment, in the same hour, in the same breath. The public years of Jesus' ministry were not easy years for Mary. The Gospel of Mark records a moment when the family came to where Jesus was teaching and tried to bring him home, because people were saying he had lost his mind. Mary was in that group. She was a mother watching her son draw crowds and stir controversy and make enemies in the highest halls of religious power, and she was trying to understand what was happening through the framework of a woman who had kept a secret for 30 years, who had been told by an angel that her son's kingdom would have no end, and who had also been told by an old man in the temple, when that son was 40 days old, that a sword would pierce her own soul. Both of those prophecies were operating in her simultaneously for 3 decades. She lived between them. She held both the promise and the warning in the same heart, the way only a mother can hold things that cannot be reconciled. Then came the cross. John 19 verses 25 through 27 contains what may be the most compressed and devastating domestic scene in all of literature. Jesus is dying. The nails have been in his hands and feet for hours. Every word he speaks costs him everything. He looks down from the wood and sees his mother standing there, and beside her the disciple he loved, the young man named John, and he says to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." And then to John, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the text says, the disciple took her into his own home. Consider what is happening in those words. A man is in the act of dying. His lungs are slowly collapsing under the weight of his own body. Every syllable requires him to push himself upward against the nails in his feet, to draw one more agonizing breath, to form words, through a throat that is parched and broken. And the thing he uses those last precious words for is to make sure his mother has somewhere to live. He is doing 2 things simultaneously, as he always did 2 things simultaneously. He is making a practical arrangement for the welfare of a widow, who will have no provider once he is gone. And he is establishing the structure of the community that will continue after him, a community organized around mutual care, around the adoption of strangers as family, around the radical proposition that love is not limited by blood, but expanded by it. John takes Mary. Mary goes with John. A family is made at the foot of a cross. This is where her post-crucifixion life begins. In the house of John. In Jerusalem. Jerusalem in the spring of the year 30, or 33 AD was a city in the particular kind of tension that precedes transformation. The Temple of Herod, one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world, was still under construction, having been under construction for decades, its white stone and gold visible from miles away in every direction. The Roman prefect Pontius Pilate administered the province with the combination of efficiency and brutality that characterized Roman governance in occupied territories. The Jewish community was internally fractured between Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes and Zealots, each group with its own vision of what faithfulness to the God of Israel required in the current political moment. And now, beginning on the morning of the first day of the week 3 days after the crucifixion, there was a new and rapidly growing group of people who were claiming that a man Rome had executed was alive, and that his resurrection changed everything. Mary was in the center of all of this. Not at the margins, where the safely private and the safely uncommitted position themselves. At the center. 50 days after the crucifixion came Pentecost. The first chapter of Acts, verse 14, places her in the upper room, with the 120 disciples waiting for the promise Jesus had made before his ascension. They were all joined together constantly in prayer, the text says, along with the women, and Mary the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers. The brothers of Jesus are significant here. The Gospel of John says clearly that during Jesus' public ministry, his brothers did not believe in him. They were skeptical. They may have been embarrassed. They were certainly concerned in the practical, protective way that family members of a controversial public figure are always concerned. But here they are in the upper room, praying in unity with the community their brother founded, transformed by something that had happened between the crucifixion and this moment. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 7 that the risen Jesus appeared specifically to James. That appearance, whatever it consisted of, turned a skeptic into the pillar of the Jerusalem church. And Mary was in the room, with him, praying. What did it mean for Mary to be in that room? She had believed for over 30 years. She had believed, before there was any evidence to believe in except the word of an angel, and the presence of a child growing inside her body. She had believed, through the ordinary years in Nazareth, and through the public years of controversy, and through the arrest, and the trial, and the hours at the foot of the cross. She had not needed the resurrection to convert her, because she had never stopped believing in the first place. She was not in the upper room waiting to be convinced. She was in the upper room waiting for what God had promised, which is a different thing entirely, the difference between doubt-seeking resolution and faith-seeking fulfillment. The Holy Spirit came. Acts chapter 2 describes it as a sound like a violent rushing wind filling the whole house, and divided tongues, as of fire appearing, and resting on each of them, and all of them being filled with the Holy Spirit, and beginning to speak in other tongues. Every person in that room. The text makes no exceptions, and grants no special privileges. Mary spoke in tongues. Mary was filled with the Holy Spirit in the same way as Peter and James and John and every other believer in that room. She was not elevated above the community. She was part of it, which is exactly what she had always been, and exactly what the community needed her to be. Because what she could offer the community was irreplaceable. The apostles knew Jesus the teacher. They knew the man who had walked into their fishing boats and their tax offices and their ordinary lives and disrupted everything. They knew the preacher and the healer and the one who had walked on water and raised Lazarus and turned water into wine. But they had known him for 3 years. They had known him as a grown man in the public fullness of his power and his mission. Mary had known him for 33 years. She had known him before he could speak. She had known the specific smell of his infant hair, and the particular way he moved his hands, and the first word he said, and the exact expression on his face, when he was 12 years old, and stood in the temple among the rabbis, and told her he had to be in his father's house. She had kept all of these things in her heart for decades, the way a person keeps something that is too precious to share casually, something that requires the right listener, and the right moment. In the community forming in Jerusalem in those years, she was the only living archive of everything that had preceded the ministry. She was the only source for the events of the birth, and the infancy, and the childhood, and the years in Nazareth, before John the Baptist appeared on the banks of the Jordan, and the whole public story began. Luke, who wrote both his Gospel and the book of Acts, says explicitly in the prologue of his Gospel that he investigated everything carefully, from the beginning, and consulted eyewitnesses before writing. The first 2 chapters of that Gospel are essentially Mary's testimony. The Annunciation and the visit to Elizabeth, and the Magnificat, and the birth in Bethlehem, and the shepherds, and the presentation in the temple, and the flight to Egypt, and the boy who stayed behind among the rabbis. None of those accounts could have originated anywhere except the memory of the woman who had lived them. The details are too intimate, the perspective too consistently maternal, the emotional texture too specific for anything other than a direct source. Luke had access to Mary, or to those who had talked to Mary, and the first 2 chapters of his Gospel are the permanent record of what she chose to share. This is one of the most overlooked aspects of those forgotten years. Mary was not a passive figure waiting to be venerated. She was an active custodian, and transmitter of the most theologically significant memories in human history. Every time the community gathered to break bread, and remember and teach, she was a living presence in that gathering who connected the present to the origin in a way no one else could. When they spoke of the birth in Bethlehem, she had been there. When they spoke of the flight to Egypt, she had carried the child in her arms through the desert. When they spoke of the boy in the temple, she had been the one searching for 3 days in a panic before finding him calmly instructing the doctors of the law. She did not need to speak for her presence to be theologically significant. But she did speak. And when she spoke, she said things no one else could say. The daily life of the Jerusalem community in those early years was intense and communal in a way that can be difficult to fully imagine from the distance of 2,000 years. Acts chapter 2 verses 44 and 45 describe it without sentimentality. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. They met daily in the temple and broke bread from house to house and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. This was the world Mary inhabited. Not the peaceful domestic world of an elder stateswoman receiving visitors with gracious dignity. A world of compressed community life, of shared resources and shared meals and shared vulnerability in a city that had killed their leader and was now watching their numbers multiply by thousands in the days following Pentecost, with the combination of alarm and hostility that power always reserves for movements it cannot control. The persecution began before the decade was out. The stoning of Stephen, narrated in Acts chapter 7, with a terrible clarity, was the opening of a period of violent pressure on the Jerusalem community that scattered many believers throughout Judea and Samaria. The young man who stood watching the execution and holding the coats of the men doing the throwing was a Pharisee named Saul of Tarsus, who would go on to make the persecution systematic and thorough. But the apostles stayed in Jerusalem. And with them, the text strongly implies, stayed Mary. Think about what it meant to stay. The city was not safe. The community was being hunted. The social pressure on any Jewish person who identified as a follower of Jesus was immense, involving potential exclusion from the synagogue, the loss of community standing, the practical consequences of being severed from the network of relationships that organized economic and social life in the ancient world. Mary had already paid every possible social price a person could pay in the village culture of Galilee for the unusual circumstances of her son's birth, and the increasingly controversial nature of his ministry, and the catastrophic public humiliation of his execution. She had been the subject of whispers for decades. She had watched her son be called a glutton and a drunkard and a friend of sinners and a blasphemer, and finally be executed by the state as an insurrectionist. None of that had moved her. She stayed in the city. She stayed in the community. She stayed because staying was what she did, had always done, would always do. This is the woman the tradition remembers imperfectly, and incompletely, and sometimes falsely, but always, at its best, with a recognition that something here resists easy categorization. She is not a saint in the sense of someone who achieves holiness through spiritual technique. She is a human being who, placed in the most extraordinary and the most ordinary of circumstances, consistently made the same choice. To stay. To serve. To trust that God's word would accomplish what God had said it would accomplish, even when the evidence was unclear, even when the sword was going through her soul, even when the silence was so complete that only faith could insist there was still something to wait for. By the year 37 AD, roughly 4 years after the crucifixion, the community Mary was part of had grown from 120 people in an upper room to a movement present in multiple cities across the eastern Mediterranean. The church in Antioch was forming, the first place where followers of Jesus would be called Christians, a word that meant something like the Christ ones, the people who belonged to the Anointed One. The gospel was moving along the Roman road network with a speed that would have been impossible in any previous century of human history, carried by travelers and merchants and missionaries who stopped in synagogues and spoke in marketplaces, and somehow, in city after city, found people who were ready to hear what they were saying. Paul's conversion happened somewhere in the vicinity of the year 34 or 35. The man who had held the coats at the stoning of Stephen was knocked from his horse, or was stopped on the road. The text doesn't specify a horse, but the image has stuck to the story for 2 millennia, and heard a voice asking him why he was persecuting the one who was speaking. He spent time in Arabia, and then returned to Damascus, and then, 3 years after his conversion according to his own testimony in Galatians, he went to Jerusalem, and stayed for 15 days, during which he met Peter, and James the Lord's brother. The community in Jerusalem in those years was small enough, that it would be difficult to be in it for 15 days, without encountering everyone who was central to it. Whether Paul met Mary during that visit cannot be established with certainty. But the phrase he uses in Galatians chapter 4 verse 4, when he writes, that God sent his Son born of a woman born under the law, has a specificity about it, that may reflect something he had learned about that birth from someone who could speak to it with authority. Born of a woman is not a generic theological formulation. It is a statement about a particular body, a particular womb, a particular yes spoken in a particular room in Galilee. Paul had been in the same city as the woman whose yes had made that statement true. It is not impossible that he knew more than his letters explicitly say. James, the brother of Jesus, became the central figure of the Jerusalem church over the years following Pentecost, and his prominence in that community meant that Mary's domestic world was shaped in part by watching her son become one of the most influential leaders in the movement her firstborn had founded. The ancient sources describe James with a consistency that suggests his reputation was not manufactured in retrospect. He was known as James the Just. He was known for a devotion to prayer, so intense and sustained, that the tradition says his knees had become calloused and hardened from the sheer accumulated hours of kneeling before God. The man who during Jesus' public ministry had been skeptical enough to join the family intervention had become, through whatever the resurrection appearance had done to him, a pillar. He would lead the Jerusalem community until 62 AD, when Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, who was not a Christian, and had no theological interest in flattering the movement's leaders, records his death by stoning on the orders of the high priest Ananus. Mary may or may not have outlived her son James. The dates are uncertain in both directions. But she had known him long enough to see the transformation, to see the man, who had doubted become the man, whose knees wore grooves in the stone from prayer. The question of where Mary spent her final years is one that the honest historian must approach with humility and without false certainty in either direction. Two ancient traditions exist, and both of them are too old and too persistent to dismiss, and neither of them is verifiable enough to insist on. The first tradition holds that John literally fulfilled the command Jesus had given him from the cross and took Mary with him when he traveled to Ephesus. John's presence in Ephesus is attested by multiple ancient sources, and the literary and theological characteristics of the Gospel of John and the letters of John have been associated by scholars over centuries with the region of Asia Minor, the western coast of what is now Turkey. A small stone house in the hills above the ancient city of Ephesus has been venerated as the House of the Virgin Mary since at least the 19th century, when a German mystic named Catherine Emmerich published visions that described the location with enough specificity that a group of researchers eventually located a site matching her description. Millions of pilgrims visit it. Popes have visited it. Whether it was actually where Mary lived cannot be established. But the tradition connecting Mary to Ephesus is not a recent or a manufactured one. It runs deep. The second tradition, which some scholars consider older, places Mary's final years and dormition in Jerusalem itself, in the neighborhood of Zion, near the upper room, where she had received the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. The Eastern Church holds this tradition with great conviction, and the Christian community of Jerusalem has venerated sites in the city connected with Mary's final days for as long as that community has existed. The Church of the Dormition on Mount Zion in Jerusalem marks the spot where tradition says she fell into the sleep of death. The site is old. The conviction behind it is old. Whether it accurately locates where those final days were spent is another question. What both traditions agree on is the one thing that matters most. Mary did not disappear into solitude or obscurity. She lived surrounded by the community she loved. She was cared for by those to whom her son had entrusted her. She was not a monument. She was a person, aging inside a body that was carrying 30 years, and then 40 years, and then perhaps more years of memories that no one else could carry. The ache of those memories must have been extraordinary. Not only the painful ones, though those were present. The ordinary ones. The specific weight of his hair when she held his sleeping head. The exact sound of his voice the first time she heard him read from the Torah scroll in the Nazareth synagogue. The smell of sawdust on his clothes when he came in from working with Joseph. These are the details that grief returns to, not the dramatic ones, but the textured ones, the ones that are almost impossible to share, because they are so specific that they resist language, and because sharing them would mean releasing them, and Mary had been holding them for so long that releasing them would have felt like a second death. She held them instead. She kept them in her heart, the way Luke's gospel says she always kept things, turned over slowly, examined from every angle, given back to God in prayer. If she was in Ephesus during any portion of her final years, she was living in one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the Roman Empire, a port city of perhaps 200,000 souls, with all the complexity and noise and religious diversity that Roman urban life entailed. Paul had spent more than 2 years in Ephesus. The church there was sophisticated and spiritually serious, the kind of community that could receive and benefit from the presence of the Mother of the Lord, a living connection to the origin of everything they believed. If she remained in Jerusalem, she lived in a city under increasing tension that would end in 67 and 68 and 69 and 70 AD in the siege and destruction that Jesus had prophesied, with a precision his disciples did not understand until they were living inside the fulfillment of it. The streets she would have walked daily were filling, year by year, with the preliminary tremors of that catastrophe. Either way, she was not passive. The tendency to render Mary as a figure of soft resignation, the gentle receptive vessel waiting quietly for heaven, does exactly what the gospel repeatedly declines to do. The gospel shows a woman who asks questions of angels. The gospel shows a woman who manages a social crisis at a wedding by telling servants to do whatever her son says, before he has agreed to do anything. The gospel shows a woman who shows up at the foot of a cross, when her son's closest male companions have scattered into the city looking for places to hide. This is not a woman of passive resignation. This is a woman of fierce, sustained, active fidelity. Her fidelity in the forgotten years was of exactly the same character. Active prayer. Active participation in the community's life. Active transmission of the irreplaceable memory she held. Active service in whatever domestic and communal form that service took in the particular setting she inhabited. Her daily life, in either Jerusalem or Ephesus, would have had the texture of any non-wealthy woman in the first-century Roman East. A compact house, often organized around an interior courtyard, that served as the center of domestic life. Water carried from a cistern or a public fountain. Bread baked daily from grain ground by hand. Olives and olive oil and legumes and seasonal fruit forming the structure of most meals. The rhythm of sunlight governing the beginning and end of each day, since artificial light was expensive and exhausting to produce. The Sabbath arriving every 7 days, with its absolute rest, observed by the Jerusalem community, with the same fidelity as the Jewish tradition from which they had come. The great festivals of the Jewish year continuing to structure time in a community that understood itself as the fulfillment of the story those festivals had always been telling. She prayed in the darkness before dawn because she had always prayed in the darkness before dawn. She kept the Magnificat moving through her mind on ordinary days, because the theology of the Magnificat was the theology by which she understood her own life, the theology of a God who scatters the proud and lifts up the humble and fills the hungry with good things. She had lived every line of that song. She had watched every line prove true. The believers who gathered with her to break bread and hear the apostles' teaching had access, by simply being in the same room with her, to the most direct possible link to the story they were trying to understand. She was not a relic. She was a living memory. When someone in the community was struggling to believe, when the cost of following Jesus was proving higher than they had anticipated, when the persecution was real, and the fear was real, and the temptation to walk back into ordinary life was real, there was a woman in their midst who had been paying that cost for longer than any of them had been alive, who had said yes before any of them had been asked, who had stood at the foot of the cross on the worst day in history, and had not moved. That was its own kind of teaching. That was its own kind of ministry. The years the title calls forgotten are not actually forgotten. They are preserved in the community that Mary helped to form, in the Gospel that Luke wrote, from the testimony she, or those close to her, provided, in the tradition that carried her story forward even when the written record went quiet. They are preserved in the fact that every Christian community in every century since has had access to the first 2 chapters of Luke, which are essentially her memoir, the most intimate account of her inner life that exists, preserved in the words of a physician who knew how to listen and how to write, and who had the wisdom to seek out the sources closest to the events he was describing. The question of what sustained her during those years, the long, ordinary, difficult, grace-filled years after the cross, and after Pentecost, and before the end, is not actually a mysterious question. The answer is the same answer that applies to anyone who has lived a life of sustained faith in conditions that would justify giving up. It is not a dramatic answer. It is not an answer that requires anything supernatural to understand, though the person who lived it would have said the supernatural was present in every ordinary morning of it. She was sustained by what she had always been sustained by the Word of God, which she had known since childhood and which had never failed to mean what it said. By the community around her, broken and complicated, and faithful and struggling, the same kind of community it has always been, the kind that keeps showing up. By the memory she carried, which was both her greatest wound and her most indestructible treasure. And by the specific, irreplaceable intimacy of waiting for someone she knew by name, by face, by the exact particular way he moved his hands when he taught. She was waiting for her son to come back. Not abstractly, the way theology speaks of the second coming, as a doctrine to be affirmed. In the particular, bodily, personal way that a mother waits for a child who has been away too long. She had heard him say he was going to prepare a place. She had heard him say he would come again. She had watched him ascend into the sky above the Mount of Olives, while the disciples stood staring upward, with their mouths open, and she had heard the angels say he would return in the same way. She believed all of it. She had always believed all of it. But believing it, as Mary believed it, was not the same as believing it as a doctrine. It was believing it as a personal promise made by the specific person she had known since before he was born. That is the inner life of the forgotten years. Not the theological analysis, though the theology is there, held by a woman who knew it more deeply than anyone. Not the community dynamics, or the political pressures, or the historical movements happening around her, though she was present in all of them. The inner life of those years is the life of a woman who once said, "I am the Lord's servant, may it be done to me according to your word," and who spent every subsequent year of her life discovering, in one way or another, that what God said he would do, he did. The promise was kept. The kingdom had no end. The sword had pierced her soul, and she had survived it, and she was still here, in whatever room she was in, praying in whatever darkness preceded whatever dawn was coming, holding in her aging body the most extraordinary collection of memories in the history of the world, waiting with the particular patience of someone who has already seen enough to know that what God begins, God finishes. She was the first to believe. She held on to the end. The 30 forgotten years are not the less important years. They may be the most important ones, because they are the years of faithfulness, without spectacle, devotion without recognition, love without the support of visible proof. They are the years every believer eventually enters. The years when the miraculous has happened, and what remains is the long, ordinary, sacred work of continuing to live inside the yes you said at the beginning. Mary lived those years the way she lived everything. Fully. Quietly. With her whole heart. And then she went home.
Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below. If this story has moved you, and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. We're preparing for you.